welcome to another episode of VNture podcast. I am Amar, and together with my glorious co-host Tauros, we will tackle the topic of famous figures in VN. Let's start with a definition. I'll use the definition provided by VNDB. This character is based on a famous person from the history of Earth. And on a rare occasion, someone is still alive. So, with that in mind, Tauros, what did you prepare for us?
Obviously, the first VN most VN fans consider when talking about famous figures from history is Fate Stay Night. For anyone unaware, Fate Stay Night is a story of fiction where magic exists in the modern world, and seven mages summon figures from human folklore to fight in a battle royale, all for the Holy Grail, a magical wish-granting device. The appeal is pretty self-explanatory. You get to see a battle royale of all these famous figures. So, just like how kids all over in every playground would always argue like Batman versus Superman, you get to see some combat encounters like Hercules versus Gilgamesh, or Robin Hood versus Vlad the Impaler, or Achilles versus Siegfried, and you get to see all of these crazy action-fueled fights. Now, the important part of using famous figures from history, especially for indie developers, is that your audience will know who these people are. Instead of, having to ask their audience to get invested in their original characters when your readers don't even know if you're writing a good VN or not, or if they should keep wasting their time with it. The whole point of having these historical characters is that people know right off the bat what they're like. That's why you'll usually see a lot of indie developers using public domain characters. And when you have something like Fate Stay Night, which was Type Moon's first official work, they were taking a pretty big gamble on, it's a safe option to introduce a lot of familiar characters to the readers who are experiencing your works for possibly the first time.
And do you feel like a lot of appeal in the Fate specifically was because of those encounters that two famous people could encounter each other and battle it out in a fantasy setting?
Oh, absolutely. A lot, it's an action VN first and foremost, so there's plenty of love given to all the fights and seeing how their combat styles differ and whether people try to fight at range or if they close the gap or if they're using magic and magecraft. Not only that, you get to see a whole bunch of different personalities and all of the possible ways people ally and betray each other in a battle royale setting. So again, Fate Stay Night is an action story through and through, and you get to see all sorts of incredible combat scenes.
I actually, now that you mention the combat-orientedness of Fate, I was always impressed how much great of an adaptation of Legend they made it so in terms of abilities and capabilities. And obviously their term of bringing the legend to life is the noble phantasm. You cannot have the talk of Fate and their depiction of real figures without talking about noble phantasms.
Oh, absolutely. And those are the trump cards everyone has in their back pocket. Well, possibly their most famous legends and tales. For example, Hercules is in the story, and he has his fable of clearing the 12 trials given to him from Athena. And it manifests in this story as him essentially having 12 lives, one for each trial he overcame, and, he's a huge bulking warrior, and so he just uses it as his strength to go charging headlong into everything.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, with Fate Stay Night as a faithful adaptation of all these legends. there are all sorts of heroes from across the world, and it's obvious that the developers put a lot of research into it. Not only just like with Hercules, but also with the Lancer, Cuckoo Lane, an Irish hero. He, famously has a cursed spear that can inflict instant death to anyone he fights. And not only that, but, Fate Stay Night is also very faithful in a lot of these characters' strengths and weaknesses. Cuckoo Lane is famously weak to curses in his original tales, and so in Fate Stay Night, that's a recurring problem with him.
And some of the... oh my god, the pronunciation I think is gears that he has cast upon himself is the weakness people can exploit if they know about his legend.
Absolutely. And yeah, the information aspect of things is a huge deal in the story. How you have other competitors in this battle royale trying to figure out your enemies' real identities. Because if you know their names, then you know their strengths, their weaknesses, you know exactly what they're capable of, and their kinds of personalities, Like, for example, if you're up against an incredible warrior skilled at hand-to-hand combat, and then you find out his name is Achilles, like, gee, I wonder what you're gonna do to win.
True.
His most famous story of dying in the Achilles tendon, like, wow, maybe you could get him there, that's how you'll win. And of course, for Achilles and his master, you're really gonna want to try to hide that information,
Exactly. So the battle of concealing and revealing information, identity, and legend is core to the story of Fate. And I really like how even the story itself is a twist. So if you remember, one of the biggest twists of the main character servant was overwhelming focus on a weapon, despite that not being the strongest legend. The strongest legend was not the weapon. And that was the very last twist they used. And if you read closely the legend from where that servant is, that's also the downfall of that character, because it depicts when that character died is when that character lost that item.
Yes. Again, I mentioned earlier how developers will like to use these public domain characters because readers are already familiar with them. They also provide a great base for these developers to write stories on. Because it's like all the drama is there. They have their famous tales of struggle, of triumph, and ultimately dying. Yeah, and so there's so much material to work with that they have a good, starting off point to jump off of. In fact, Fate Stay Night has 3 routes that get tackled in order from Fate, Unlimited Blade Works, Heaven's Feel, and the first 2 routes are mostly about the Battle Royale and seeing these cool characters duke it out, but by the 3rd route, the focus turns more onto the VN's original characters. The original characters of their story. And it can start focusing on their tales, instead of having to rely on these famous figures kind of like as a storytelling crutch,
Yeah. I mean, from my perspective, when I look at those routes in Fate specifically, I feel like the first one is the introductory one, because you are going blind. You don't know anybody, his identity, weaknesses, legend, etc. By the end of the first route, you have an idea. So as a reader, you are more capable. So by the second route, and just to note, in Fate, it's enforced reading order. So by the second time, the game expects you to come with some knowledge, so it can throw more stuff at you, which is nice, very, very nice solution for preventing info dumping. So that's a very good way of dealing with that. And by the third route, they are focusing, like you said, on the original characters, but more so on the behind-the-scene events. whereas on the first two, it's more of the tournament itself, and I wouldn't say public knowledge, but rather still in the open. By the third route, you are very much in the shadows and dealing with what was behind the curtains all along.
Yes, it's this Fate's Day and Night is definitely structured very well, logically, from starting point of knowing nothing to getting more familiar to dumping more interesting concepts your way.
Yeah,
I think a large part of that is based on how faithful an adaptation the work is with its famous figures. They definitely could have taken liberties if they wanted to in this for the sake of making stories more entertaining or whatnot. But I was actually impressed with how much research they did and how faithful they remained.
Exactly, because they stuck to the original legends as much as possible, obviously taking some liberties with their adaptation whenever necessary to fit their own narrative. But as much as they could, they stuck with, and that's a very good point, because what I prepared for this episode is the inspirational aspect. So where Fate takes an adaptation, tries to adapt those legends, tries to depict them as closely as possible. I'll talk about Venus Blood Frontier, the title that does the inspirational approach, meaning they take the Norse mythology and take inspiration from it. I mean, it's very easy. I'll name characters, and for those who know them, they will understand the what to expect out of it. The main character is named Loki. He is not the strongest one, but he's definitely one of the wisest, wittiest, and uses his clever tactics to paint a story of underdog coming against the people way stronger than him, and pantheon of gods that he fights against consists of such characters as Odin and Thor, for example. They are not limited to those names, but those are probably the most famous from the Norse mythology. I specifically named this title because this is one of those titles that made me go outside of VN. And what I mean by that, since I recognize Loki, Thor, Odin, when I encounter someone else, Gram, and I am not well versed with Norse mythology to know on the first note who the hell that character represents, I pause the game, I open Google, I read about my Norse mythology to educate myself, and then go back to the VN and say, a Garm, which in Norse mythology is depicted as a wolf or a dog associated with some Ragnarok event, maybe a guard dog to some gate. In this VN, he is a faithful companion to Loki. So there's some similarity to that, because that character is a werewolf, so it's a dog but humanoid shape. So you see the inspiration there, but still twisted in a way that suits their story they want to tell. The same goes that there is a character of Jorm, which is shorthand for Jormungandr. Again, I had to pause the game, look it up. I see it's about a snake, a viper, so something depicted as a viper. And in the game, it's represented obviously by an anime girl, but she has a snake-like qualities to her, mostly pertaining to her using venomous armament. So their liberal approach and very much open-ended inspiration produced something that had a feedback loop with me. Every time I see a named character, I had to pause the game, open my Google, type the name, probably very poorly, and see how that relates to the original. So that's very interesting, because I'm not well versed in the Norse mythology, but I would like to believe I am slightly more after reading that VN, and that's not necessarily because of the VN, because the story they told is pretty unique one. It's not really the Norse mythology retold, but rather the characters were so interesting in that story, I wanted to know the originals.
The same here. I remember reading Fate's Day Night, and it definitely introduced me to more cultural heroes and legends that I had never heard of before, so I searched them out, read more about them, and enjoyed those tales too, just like how you did.
Yeah, so this kind of inspirational in both senses, so for author to get inspired by character, and me as a reader to get inspired to investigate, I really like. So from those series, Wings of Blood, I really liked the Frontier, just because of that aspect. I kept pausing the game just to read more about Norse mythologies. And that's not something I experience often. So that takes a special kind of VN that relates to some sort of general idea of, or maybe a work that I have a concept of, for me to pause it and look up the original. But all in all, I really enjoyed it. And I remember specifically when they ran a survey, because this is a Kickstarter funded title. And I think it was around 2 months after the release, they sent out surveys. And I was around, say, after first ending, around 30% done with the game. Somewhat in that vein. A rough estimate. I sent them a feedback. Yeah, this was one of the most interesting way for me to get inspired to get to know the Norse mythology.
Nice. When you first picked up the game, what interested you about it? Because you mentioned before you didn't know anything about Norse mythology, so I'm assuming, you picked it up for unrelated reasons. Is that right?
Yes. How can I describe it so people won't call me degenerate in the comments? It was a Kickstarter project that focused on tentacles.
Okay.
I mean, what can I add? And I don't really like that topic, but I felt they had a very good premise. The Kickstarter sounded really nice and detailed. It read like they had a lot of passion to their own series, and I wanted to back them up with that.
Okay.
They got a huge success with that Kickstarter, so on the next one, on the Hollow, I backed even harder.
Oh, nice. So they really made a fan out of you. And, like I mentioned, you wound up learning a lot about different mythological heroes, even though that wasn't the point of it.
Yeah.
And even though that wasn't the focus of it, like you didn't go in because you're a huge Norse buff or whatever, Yeah.
Oh, yeah, and I probably should mention, and I don't know why the hell I mentioned tentacles before that, probably because it's more distinctive and more highlighted, but this was a gameplay tactical VM. So that was also a enticing prospect, because it was very much a strategy oriented with creating your own units and mixing, matching battalions.
Okay.
And I was very curious how that all relates back to the story, because by the end of the day, VNs live and die by the story, not gameplay.
Yes, very true.
This title showcased that they can have both. They have a very, very in-depth and expansive gameplay that I love, but still have very interesting and intriguing story, even though it reads probably for those who are the Norse mythology geeks like a fanfic. For me, who doesn't know the Norse mythology that well, it was cool story, but for those who know it very well and are Norse mythology purists, they would probably treat it as a fanfic of sorts.
Yeah, not something to take too seriously, right?
Yeah, but that's fine.
Of course. Mm-hmm. Let's see. Going back onto the whole topic. Real life people.
Yes.
1 second, technical difficulty.
Sure, fair enough. I mean, when it comes to real people, the other title I prepared is Newton and the Apple Tree. So I can talk a little bit more because this is, if I consider Venus Blood Frontier as number one, then probably Newton is number two when it comes to the feedback loop of me pausing the game and checking it out. Because what Newton achieved on my end is to get interested in how the scientific papers were made across the time span of history.
Mm-hmm. Because the title, Newton and the Apple Tree, that's referencing Sir Isaac Newton and discovering gravity, right?
Exactly. So just a synopsis. This is a title about... I think the closest comparison is the story of Back to the Future, but this time it circles around Isaac Newton. You get thrown back into the past. You encounter Isaac Newton, who is obviously an anime girl, like all things should be. And then your point is to not interfere with the past so that the future does not get changed. And then hijinks ensue. Across the story, you encounter some famous works that Isaac Newton did, and preserving their original intent was the sole purpose of the story. So, but still, for me, first time I reading what are those papers, I had to stop the game, open Google, and hopefully typing as close as possible, Google what is the Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, for example. It's a very famous paper that Newton wrote. And again, maybe I'm easily seduced by anime girls, okay? Fine, I admit. But this made me so much more interested in the famous people from the side of scientific papers across the time span of history. So that was very unique in that aspect.
Because did it just involve Sir Isaac Newton himself? Or I'm assuming there are other characters involved who are related, right?
Yes, there are other characters involved, including rival characters, and it was... I completely forgot the name, but the surname was Howe? Howoe, something like that, who was a rival of Isaac that had a different paper against Isaac when they were at university at that point. Please don't ask me specific, I will butcher the story. But the general gist, there was other people in that history and in that time frame which rivaled when it comes to scientific merit, and that merit being gauged by the quality of paper they produce. That was the gist. Sorry?
Robert Hooke?
Also. Probably there's more than one.
Oh dear. But like you said, they're using these rich, already crafted stories as a basis, right?
Yes. But probably unlike Venus Blood, this was closer to the truth, although we don't know that closely how that all transpired.
And also, Sir Isaac Newton was not a little girl.
Don't say that. Don't say that.
But still, you're right. It was enjoyable, and you did end up learning a lot about the history of scientific development.
Exactly. So again, this is number two when it comes to the inspiration to read outside of the game itself.
Mm-hmm.
Did you experience something like that?
Yeah, like I told you, with Fate Stay Night, I definitely learned a whole lot about other characters. Speaking of which, though, there's one important distinction, is that in Fate Stay Night, I did mention how faithful the characters were to their real life histories and whatnot.
Yep.
Whereas obviously you get into something such as Newton and the Apple Tree, which is dealing with real people from history and taking liberties with their stories.
Yes.
And although, like, as we keep mentioning, there are beneficial results to us readers experiencing these previous past events and knowledge, there is the question of how respectful it is to the original people of their time.
Yes.
To be honest, it's a hard question, honestly, because there's a case for both. You can say how famous figures should be treated with respect, especially for their descendants who might be related to the family name and whatnot. On the other hand, you also kind of have to lighten up and realize this is just a fun story that people hopefully are not taking seriously. So if it's for silly entertainment, that's kind of an entirely different matter, you know? It's possible you can both respect people's famous contributions to history and the real-life shenanigans that they went up with, all while learning more about it in complete comedic scenarios, right?
Yep, I agree completely. Not everything has to be serious documentation and documentary of their tales. And you can still make a parody with respect. So you can create a character, even a caricature of that famous person, yet still treat it with respect for the contribution across history they provided. And the example I have that did it, how can I say it? On one end, it did it well. But on the other hand, the focus on comedy was to the detriment of the story, was Eosenki. Eosenki was a title that should check out all the MR boxes, but it actually something that I didn't like.
Oh no.
Despite it being a gameplay VM, despite it being a strategy of conquering cities and having your battalions, troops, and armies, ultimately, this game was just a snoozer in terms of story, because they took, instead of how Fate treated its characters, with legends, battle royale, drama, and mystery, instead of how Venus Blood treated its characters, with an original story set out in a fictional place, using inspiration from mythology, and trying to depict those mythological characters in their anime personas. Unlike Newton, who took the real person, but treated that character with anime girl beam, but still preserve what was core to the story of Isaac Newton in a scientific world. Eosenki just over-exaggerate every single famous person, and the story they took is the most generic. They turn bad because they touch the dark cloud, and if you beat them, they become your friend. That's the story. And oh my god, I cannot describe to you how boring that was after a few hours.
Yeah, that sounds boring after the first couple of times it happens, and then
exactly
for
because
hours.
Every single time it happened, the excuse was they were corrupted by the dark mist and they were evil. So you beat them and they stop being evil and they are your friend. And oh my god, that was boring. So that was the overall story. Even though the caricature and the satire of those famous people as an anime girls was, it's funny. What can I say? The Napoleon Bonaparte being a tsundere was enjoyable to a certain degree. And my favorite character was Benkei. Oh my god, I completely forgot the first name. Musesoko Benkei, the character from, I think it was Japanese folklore.
Mm-hmm. I don't know about folklore, but Japanese history,
okay.
Yes.
Oh yeah, from Japanese history. And that character collected swords. And that was the best story I have read in that game. Because every single time an event with that character came up, you were hunting famous swords or famous items across the history. So,
Oh, wow.
That was so phenomenal. You met so many famous items, such as Gungnir, such as Mjolnir, such as... What was the name of that? Vaira? From the Indian mythology. It was in Fate.
Oh my goodness, I know what you're talking about.
You see the item I'm talking about. You were collecting all those treasures across the time and in the span of history. That was the most fun sub-quest I had in that game. It's basically treasure hunting on all the famous artifacts.
Oh, that's hilarious. Because it was all over the world, too. Like, there's no explanation why this character has all of these fantastic treasures, right?
Yeah, but again... that character, Musashi Benkei, doesn't have them on her, but rather you, together with her, hunt for those items.
Aha.
So there is a hunt for Trishul, a very famous trident. And you have your collection of tridents, your collection of swords. That was amazing. I always loved those sub-quests with that character. But the main story was... it was a slog, and it had no payoff. So even that was not met. Because again, I can survive a slog and slow burner, but if there's absolutely no payoff, it's disappointing to no end. But I did read a lot about famous items in that game and outside when I googled some of those.
Mm-hmm. Well, you got some good out of it then, even if you didn't enjoy it. And
exactly.
at least it makes for a funny story, too.
Oh, that's true.
Before we wrap this up, the last title I wanted to talk about is Who is the Red Queen?
Okay.
Specifically because this one is a visual novel heavily inspired by Alice's Alice in Wonderland. Sorry, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland.
Yep.
The whole Wonderland setting is surprisingly popular over in Japan. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but I guess something about the whimsicality and the ridiculous characters and just the whole premise of Alice being lost in an unknown land just really makes for an enjoyable setting whenever other Japanese creators want to create a new setting for a story. Whether it's the entire VN or even just a few, silly dream sequences. It comes up pretty often, I'm surprised.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that VN, but Alice in the Wonderland is such an important title to adapt in Japan. The entire genre of isekai is born through it, right?
I don't know about directly from it, but yeah, isekais are, a normal person in today's world dies, and then they're reincarnated into some fantasy land. And to be honest, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland has a similar setting, with a similar premise, where someone suddenly finds himself in a strange land and they think, oh my goodness, I have to go back. All while they're exploring all sorts of zany characters and weird rules that make no sense, and they're just completely lost in all of this weirdness.
I think the synopsis that you outlined is probably the most common one. So, person dies, reincarnated in the fantasy world. Although that's not really the core. The core is to be summoned in a fantasy world, which does not necessitate you being dead, but probably is the biggest cliche in isekai. And the transportation from the real world to the fantasy world is such an obvious inspiration from Alice in the Wonderland.
Yeah.
You can't have it even more, right?
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of, I guess you could say, dreamlike quality to it.
Oh yeah, true.
Escapism. Anyway, but specifically with the indie VN, Who is the Red Queen, one thing I really like about it is that it draws inspiration from Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, but it also makes the setting its own. There's also a very violent undercurrent to it, where it still has the silliness of the original setting, but there's also fear involved as the main character comes up into a world where the inhabitants are very confused about the Red Queen's sudden disappearance, who apparently is ruling over the land with an iron fist. And not the kind of silliness from the original story, where she was shouting, off with their heads, and it was played for laughs,
Yeah.
This was apparently a wonderland that was very much scarier queen in charge.
I see.
And so, yeah, that's what I really like. When you have these famous figures from children's stories, in this case, that people are all familiar with, but then you tweak them a little and really make them your own creation. Oh yes, you have Alice, and you have the Red Queen, and you have the Mad Hatter, and the Cheshire Cat. And everyone's familiar with their basic identities, but you tweak them just a little to make them your own characters, and for your readers to really get involved into your story. That's why I really like this one, just in general, not even as a specific example of, famous figures, but just, I thought it was a great story that used its environment well.
I mean, yeah, and it's a very popular setting and inspiration in Japan.
Totally. Oh, well, that about wraps up all of my material for today, for this pretty wide-ranging topic, right?
Sure. And with all of those topics exhausted, I have to, once more, thanks every listener that tuned up to our podcast for listening in. And once more, thanks for all the feedbacks you leave. We try to address all the suggestions you provide and make every episode better and better. And on that note, thanks all the listeners and have a good day.
A good day. See you next week.